Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the launch of the 2022 Voice of the Contact Center Consumer Research by CCMA, and once again supported by Odigo. And thank you so much for taking the time. I hope you've got a nice full cup of your favorite caffeinated beverage close at hand, because I've got some data for you. I hope you like a bit of data, because there's going to be a bit of it that I'm going to share with you. And this is all about how our customers and the general public are seeing the world of customer contact, how they're interacting with us, what they want, and what they're doing. And the beauty of having done this now for this is actually the second official time we've done it, but we've been tracking this now for a few different ways, and it means that we can actually start to really see how things are changing. So let me just quickly load up my slides, and if this would be a great time to get a cup of your favorite caffeinated beverage if you haven't already got one. So we've got a really full hour coming up for you, and I'm really delighted to announce that we've got some other people who are going to join me in discussing and debating some of these findings, who I'll introduce in just a second. I want to tell you a little bit about the research, just in case you're wondering what we did. So actually, we did a number of things. We started off with a consumer survey. So we ran a pretty large survey of just over 2,000 people all across the UK, representing all regions of the UK. And it's a representative sample. So we control for things like region, age, and gender, just to make sure that it's proportional to the population. So when we share findings at the UK level, you can feel very comfortable that this is pretty representative of the UK. And in some cases, I'm going to break it down a little bit. So I'll show you some comparisons where it's interesting to do so by age, and in some cases, actually by gender, some interesting gender differences, which is a new thing for 2022. What we then did after we completed the survey is that we had a number of group discussions with some of the brands that you can see. So folks like yourself, contact center leaders, representing a pretty broad mix of brands, as you can see, the sort of sectors that we've got represented in this. And the report, which is getting launched later today, it's a free download from ccma.org.uk, is an amalgamation of the survey results, part of which I'm going to share with you, as well as the comments and the insight and the context provided by those leaders, which you can read in the report. I've pulled out a few of those quotes, which I'll share with you in this presentation. I'm really happy also to let you know that Andy Davis from Virgin Wines and Neris Caulfield from Injection Consulting, who took part in those discussions, will be joining me during the course of this hour to discuss live and share some of their takes from this research. So the agenda that I'm going to share, we're going to go through today, we're going to actually have two panel discussions. I'm going to share part of the research on the state of customer service. Is customer service getting better or not? And a huge topic, of course, for the last couple of years, and still the hottest of topics, is around self-serve. What's happening in the world of self-serve? Are consumers really continuing to embrace self-serve or not? Then we're going to discuss that with Neris and with Andy, and then I'm going to share with you some other topics. I also invite you to submit any questions you have for me or for Neris or Andy in the Q&A panel, which you should be able to see in Zoom, and we do our best to try and get to those questions before the end of the hour. So hope you're sitting tight, and we're about to go. But before I get into my agenda, I'd like to ask you some questions. So I'm going to do my best Les Dennis impression, or if you're as old as me, Bob Monkhouse. Let's run a poll. Let's run a poll. I'm really interested in asking you the same questions that we asked the consumers in the survey. So if we can pull up the first poll question. The question is, would you say the customer service overall today has improved, worsened, or stayed the same in the past 12 months? So thinking about a year ago versus now. If you think it's improved a lot, then tick the 5 button. If you think it's improved somewhat compared with a year ago, tick the 4 button. If it's about the same, it's 3. If you think customer service today is worse, somewhat worse compared with a year ago, it's 2. And if you think it's a lot worse, then it's 1. So cast your votes. Let's see what you think, and then we'll share with you, Mr. Babbage style, what the survey said. Cast your votes, and I'm going to give you about 30 seconds. Everybody on the line. Is customer service getting better? Has it improved? Or has customer service, and you can answer this as a customer service professional, you can answer this as a consumer, it doesn't matter. I'm just interested in your opinion either way. Is it better? Is it worse? Is it about the same? I'll just get a few more seconds for you to cast your votes. Okay, let's see the results. What have we got? Oh, interesting. Okay, not many of us think it's improved a lot. A few of us think it's got a lot worse. The majority of us, more than 90% of us on this call, think it's about the same, improved somewhat, sort of sitting in the, not sitting on the fence, but sitting in that sort of middle 2, 3, 4. So not many of us think are at the extremes, but it's either the same, or it's improved somewhat, or it's somewhat worse. Very, very interesting. Okay, I've got one more question for you before I share with you what the survey said. Second question, please. Have you ever stopped buying from an organization because you didn't agree with its values? So this is you as a consumer. As a consumer, we're all consumers. As a consumer, have you ever stopped buying from an organization because you didn't agree with its values? Simple question. Yes or no? Yes or no? 10 seconds to answer. Have you ever stopped buying from an organization because you didn't agree with that organization's values? 3 seconds, 2, 1. Let's see the results. There we go. 3/4 of us have indeed stopped buying from an organization because we didn't agree with its values. Very interesting results there. Thank you so much for voting. So what did the survey say? Well, let's start with the state of customer service. So this is something that now we've been able to do for the second year in a row. And I think this will become one of the, if you like, the foundational pieces around the voice of the customer, voice of the contact center consumer research. So we asked exactly the same question that you've just answered, and here are the results. Here are the results that we saw. So opinions are actually divided pretty much as we saw in our own poll. And actually, if you look across this, and if you collapse the left 2 bars, the blue bars, it's getting better, versus the green bar, it's about the same, versus the yellow and the orange bars, it's got worse. You kind of have about 3 buckets. You've got about a third of us, or the third of the British public, who say it's getting better. You've got about a third of the public who say it's about the same. And you've got about a third of the public who say it's getting worse. And actually, if you think back to our poll, it's not a million miles away, about at sort of 1/3. So opinions are divided. I wouldn't say there's a consensus, but opinions are certainly divided. And just like in our own poll, most people sit within that it's somewhat better, it's somewhat worse, or it's about the same. And we don't have as many people at the extreme. So that's one view of the world. I wouldn't say it's inconclusive, but it's certainly not unanimous. What is really interesting is that when you actually start cutting this by different groups, and particularly by age group. Now, of course, this is a generalization. People are different. Not every 55-year-old is the same as every other 55-year-old, but it's interesting to see when you aggregate people according to age groups, some differences in their views of the state of customer service. What you can see from this chart is that people who are towards the younger end of the age spectrum, aged 18 to 34, are much more likely to think that customer service is improving. Twice as likely, in fact. People aged 18 to 34, on the whole, are twice as likely to think that customer service is improving than to think that customer service is getting worse. But when you then look at the 55 plus, the situation is actually reversed. And people aged 55 plus are more than twice as likely on the whole to say that customer service is getting worse than to say customer service is getting better. And the 35 to 54 are somewhat in the middle. So there is clearly a relationship between the outlook on customer service and your life stage. And this is something I've talked about before. And I think it's probably quite easy to just to maybe dismiss this, or to say, well, of course this is going to be true, because we know that there's been huge strides toward digitalization of channels, particularly in the past couple of years. And we know that earlier adopters, or should we say younger people, tend to be earlier adopters of digital technologies. And if you are age 55 plus, you're probably not as digitized, and this is maybe not a surprise. And I think that's true. I think the age effect and the early late adoption piece is definitely a factor here. I've said this before, I want to say it again. I also think that we need to work harder to be digitally inclusive. And in fact, if anything, I think this is even a bigger topic this year than it was last year, as more and more of our contact is migrating and we are pushing our customers to digital. We've got to make sure those journeys, those experiences, those channels are suitable, not just for digitally savvy young people, but for everybody. And I think as the next slide will also further exemplify, we're not doing enough to include people on the more mature end of the spectrum. So if we just look at that group, if we just look at the 55 pluses and we look at the results from last year versus this year, so the top bar is this year, and if you add those numbers up, that tells us that 43% of the 55 plus age group to say that customer service is getting worse, compared to only 19% who say it's getting better. Last year, the results were 43 and 22. So it's actually getting worse, if you like. The proportion of 55 plus who say it's getting worse is even bigger than it was last year. So we're even more leaving them behind, or shall I say, not being sufficiently inclusive, or in the minds of our more mature customer base, things are moving in the wrong direction. And we could spend a lot of time discussing why that is, but my message is we need to work harder to bring these people into our increasingly digitalized world. And let's not forget, there's more than 16 million people in the UK aged 55 plus. That's an awful lot of people who aren't happy with the way that things are going. Here's some quotes from contact center leaders when I presented this to them. Customers are frustrated when they hear providers saying, we've got a COVID problem and we've got a staff problem. And that's still a reality. You still dial in, you hear some recorded messages, please bear with us. We've got a COVID problem. We're still working through the pandemic. If you've still got that on your recorded message or on your IVR, please take it away, because that just frustrates people. Also, some customers are going through financial difficulties, which only contributes to their frustration. Of course, we are, even as we come out of lockdown conditions and life returns to something resembling normality, we've got a whole new set of challenges now this year compared to where we were last year. Vulnerability is only on the rise. Financial difficulties, financial constraints, we all know what a challenge and what sort of headwinds we're facing. And that only contributes to their frustration when you're trying to get through to customer service, and actually you really, really have to, because you're really having difficulty paying a bill, or you're really having difficulty with something. The stakes are even higher than they were 12 months ago. Our people have been having an increasingly difficult time with frustrated customers. I wonder how the psyche of the nation has changed as a result of the pandemic. This is a really interesting one for me. And I hear a lot of evidence, unfortunately, around a lot of anecdotes around how increasingly people in the contact center and the front line are having to deal with angry, frustrated, even abusive customers. We've come through such a difficult couple of years, and we've entered a new period, which is arguably just as challenging and just as frustrating. And what does that mean for the people who bear the brunt of this on the front line? And what does that mean for us as leaders in supporting them? I'll just ask the question. Have a think about the challenge, and particularly when you have so many people, particularly aged 50 and plus, who are not happy with the way that things are going. What does that mean, and how do we respond to that? I want to move on and talk about self-serve. So this is also one of the foundational topics of the Voice of Contact Center consumer research. It's around self-serve. And of course, particularly in the last 2.5 years, we've worked incredibly hard to try to migrate demand, particularly the simple demand, the easy demand, to take the simple stuff away from the contact center and the people on the front line, allow consumers to self-serve themselves in a convenient way, so that it keeps the lines open for the more complex things that can't be self-served. Last year, we saw rapid normalisation of self-serve. So we saw very, very quickly that consumers were really embracing self-serve. Is that still the case this year? Well, let's take a look at the results. So the question is, would you prefer to be assisted, or would you be happy to self-serve yourself for each of these type of queries? And the dark bar is, I would prefer to be assisted, and the light bar is, I'd be happy to serve myself. So as we've seen in previous years, whether or not people are comfortable self-serving really depends on the type of query, and this is not a surprise. If you look at the queries at the bottom, these are the simpler types of queries: opening an account, update on my delivery. That's the type of customer journey that customers are happy to do themselves. If you go to the top of the chart, a complaint, a refund, something related to my bill, that's where people want the, if you like, the security, the certainty, the ability to talk to humans. And I'm sure that's not a surprise because that plays out for all of us, for all of us who offer self-serve capabilities. But it's still really important to remember that, at least as far as the consumer is concerned, self-serve is better for some things than it is for others. Now, if I show you how that's changed in the last 12 months, so this is the percentage point change versus when we asked the exact same question 12 months ago. And remember, when I was presenting this 12 months ago, it all gone up. So the preference to self-serve had gone up across all the different types of customer journeys. What we can see here is that when it comes to the ones at the bottom, particularly delivery. So delivery preference, self-serve preference last year was 46, it's gone up to 51. Delivery is probably the archetypical use case for self-serving. There's so many great self-serve delivery capabilities from all of the providers. We've just kind of got used to it now. Why would you even want to talk to a human for your simple delivery update when there's so many great self-serve capabilities available from most providers today? So delivery continues to forge ahead in terms of the consumer preference. But in other areas, and particularly the ones where there is naturally more complexity and more things can go wrong, and where there is more emotional content, when you want to complain, when you want to get a refund, when there's a problem with your bill, when you want to, when you need something repaired, or when you need some technical support. What's really interesting in 2022 is actually this has gone down. The preference to self-serve has gone down compared with 12 months ago. And that's really, really interesting. And what that's suggesting to me is that we, the great British public, we've got some experience under our belts now. Self-serve is not as new as it was 12 months ago. So we've got some experience under our belts. And we're starting to learn what it's good for. Perhaps we've had bad experiences trying to self-serve more complex queries. And we're starting to differentiate between the simpler ones and the more complex ones. And we're starting to realize self-serve is great for simple stuff like deliveries. And maybe it's not so great for more complex things. That's really, really interesting, this sort of bifurcation or division that's starting to happen from the customer perspective. Here's an interesting quote for one of our contact center leaders. Trust is a big factor when it comes to things like warranty repair. You'd prefer to talk to somebody to reduce the chances that the provider might try to wriggle out of honouring the warranty. And I think that's just a really nice way to frame it. When there's a lot at stake, you really need to trust the provider. And if you don't have that trust, the best way is to talk to a human being. A lot of us talk about Amazon, and I'll reference Amazon. Amazon probably gets talked about too much, but Amazon is a brand that you just trust the self-serve journeys work. And so actually, you don't necessarily think, oh, I need to talk to somebody at Amazon, because you trust that Amazon's self-serve journeys work. But for a lot of providers, that trust may not necessarily be in place. And actually, when you don't have that trust, the easiest thing to do and the most logical thing to do is actually talk to a human being, because you're just not sure if you'll get what you need from the self-serve. Let's break it down by age. And you can see here, this is quite a busy chart, but hopefully it's still fairly self-explanatory. The green bar is the 55 plus. I'm willing to self-serve this type of journey. The dark bar at the bottom is the 18 to 34. I'm willing to self-serve this type of journey. So there's a couple of things that stand out for me. When it comes to those more complex ones, more complex journeys, refund, complaint, this is where you've got more reluctance from the 55 plus cohort, which I think is understandable. Again, this is where, particularly if you are in that age group, you're much more likely to want to talk to a human. And there's more comfort, there's more familiarity. It's more normalized with younger people. But actually what stands out to me, if anything, even more, is actually if you go towards the top, the simple stuff, opening an account, opening an order, placing an order, delivery, actually a lot of people, even those age 50 plus, are really happy to self-serve. So this for me actually slightly challenges my earlier sort of point around, well, actually older folks just don't embrace the technology because they're older. It slightly challenges that, because you can see here, at least for the simpler journeys, the 55 plus group actually are willing. They are willing to do these types of journeys online. And I think the challenge that we're facing, and if you overlay what we saw earlier about the direction of travel for customer service, is their experiences aren't great. They're willing to do it, but they're not getting the right experiences. And what are we going to do about it? I just want to show you another cut as well by gender. And what we see here, light blue bars are women and dark blue bars are men, is that actually women tend to want to self-serve for the simpler journeys at the top and are less willing to self-serve for the complex journeys at the bottom. This could be a very interesting debate, and there could be a number of different interpretations of what's going on here. I'm not going to give you mine, but if you want to read it, I'll invite you to read my interpretation in the report. At this point, I'm gonna stop presenting. I'm going to ask Neris and Andy to come onto the camera, and let's talk about this. Let's be really interested in hearing Neris and Andy's comments and thoughts, and please make all of you make use of the Q&A and put your questions in, and we'll try to get to those questions. So maybe let's start with you, Andy. You've seen this before, and I've just shared it with you again. What stands out to you?
I mean, ironically, I was looking at the questions that were coming, and I saw one from Mike, which talked about how it works about customers' perceptions and using excuses and things. I think it's really difficult because customers don't know from the outdoor in what's happening with the world and within contact centres and within the challenges we've had. I mean, I don't think anyone ever sat down and thought, you know what, let's all work from home. Let's get people working from home and things. I don't think anyone pre-COVID planned that. So actually, the work that went behind the scenes was a hell of a lot of work, and I think businesses were amazing to get it done the way they did. But unfortunately, that was, we have transitioned out of that now, and I think the difficulty I see is that when Mike said, people have lost patience, I think some people are now. I think if you send an email and you're told you'll get a reply in 30 days, that does sting you now, and I think customers are losing their understanding, and I think that's putting more pressure on the contact centres and the staff. Because a year ago, every single call I overheard ended with "Stay safe, look after yourselves." That understanding is easing a little bit now. When people aren't getting things straight away, the understanding levels I think have dropped somewhat, and I think now money is more important. We sell an item which, well, to some it's not a direct dependency, it's not an insurance that you must have, it's a nice to have, and I think people just are becoming a little bit more demanding for their money.
I think you're right, and I think it's probably fair from the consumer's perspective to expect that after 2.5 years we've got our act together. We in the industry know why that's hard. We all know why it's incredibly difficult, and we continue to have those challenges. But should consumers really care? I think from the consumer perspective, if I put my hat on as a consumer, you should have sorted it out by now. So that's kind of the challenge that we're facing, is that forgiveness is longer.
Yeah, I think it's true, and I think there's still an incredible amount of people though that unfortunately you do speak to customers and they say, look, please bear with us, there is a pandemic. The IVRs that you hear, just generally when you work through consumers, you are told, call times will be excessive, please bear with us. There is a pandemic going on and things, and I think it's, I think customers have just grown tired of seeing it because everyone's trying to move forward and in their own way. I think they're all just everyone's just customers just want to go back to almost like what the new normal is.
Thanks, Andy. Hey, Neris, what's your take on the state of customer service and self-serve?
I don't think it's forgivable that we've gone backwards. I don't think it's forgivable at all. This is really depressing. If this was a UK PLC NPS score, we'd be at -2. I mean, if you had a -2 score of NPS, you'd be thinking there's a lot we need to do. And I think the trigger around throwing more channels in and trying to implement self-service and them not being designed with the right consideration has affected people's experiences. So it's interesting to see the shift on self-serve and people's trust in self-serve, and that changing and reducing, especially for those top criteria contact drivers. That's all about that execution being poor when it was being engaged with, and people going, this is a waste of time. I'm not going to self-serve if it's actually going to take me more time, if actually I've got to elevate up to a call anyway, if I'm not going to get the answers I need. So I think that's really fascinating. And I think that the results of the survey are very aligned to the results that we see here. You know, there's 2% of people on this call that think that it's improved a lot. And it's like, well, I'd love to know what they're doing. And they obviously feel very proud of the experience that they are now giving. But quite so interesting to see that people talk about empowering with self-service. And of course, if your persona base is and your profile of customer is down at that lower end, 20 below 25, then you're dialing into their needs and you're improving it. But if you've got a segment that cuts across all ages, all profiles, all geographies, then you've got no excuse for not serving them well on the voice channel, because it's clear from this report that the voice channel is still valid. And digital nudging, self-serve nudging, are you nudging? Are you shoving? Are you empowering? How are you playing that? Because people are getting it wrong, clearly. So, yeah, I think it's fascinating.
I would agree with that. Sorry, Stephen. I think it's just using a personal example from that. When the pandemic was really in its rise, obviously within the wine industry, our sales were obviously flying up, due to that period. And one of the questions we asked is, people started talking to us about bots. Do we look at bots? Because we didn't have that at the time. Everything we work on is the personal service. And they were saying, oh, do we do bots? Well, we could rush this in for you, and we could do this, and we could generate that. And I sat down with my CEO and we were talking about it. And the risk factor was that we were just going to give people a car crash service, but tick a box and say, that's okay, we've self-served now, customers will be happy. Now we actually, we held our nerve with it and actually worked down the route of continuing to not change the model, but just, provide, be sensible and smart and review the data every day and try and understand where you had to fight your fires and where you would accept that things were going to get tougher, but continue to bridge that gap and be flexible, and don't write an IVR off saying, bear with us, trying to stay close, but still being relevant and still being understanding to the fact that, it was the busiest times. It was like 3 peaks all in one within 24 hours when kind of Boris shut us down. But I think it was really easy for people just to make snap decisions and think, wowzers, there's too many customers. They need to sort themselves out. And then almost not trialing and erroring and scoping out what the risk patterns are. And I think, you go on some channels now and the self-service experience is amazing. And, it's actually probably better and quicker. But then I don't know if some of you on this may have gone on chats for, and you're talking to a bot, which again is fine when it works, but you're not getting the response you need. There's no function to say, can I be referred to an assistant? And then you try and call in, and then it's running you through something, and you press 0 to try and get out of it, but you're just going through these notes. And then it cuts you off because it hasn't hit, you haven't come up, what you want isn't the right fit. So it just ends the call. And, I think it's, I think we have to be careful not to assume what we think customers now need, and actually, don't lose the values of what they've always wanted from you as a business.
Quite right. I think one of the biggest learnings in the last couple of years is that we've been doing what's right for the business and assuming that's also right for the customer. And there's been a lot of deflection of assisted channels because, frankly, the business hasn't been able to handle all of that demand. So we've tried to deflect as much of that demand into self-serve. The problem is when the self-serve experience, as you were talking about, Neris, isn't up to par, that just creates pain and frustration with the customer. So if you are going to deflect, you better make sure that your self-serve journeys are really up to snuff. Even if they are, you should still keep the option for assisted open, because that's what the customer wants. And we'll come on to channels in just a second. I just want to quickly address a couple of questions I'm seeing on chat. Amanda asks, does this include web chat, bots, or virtual help? And I think that was related to the self-serve. The question was about self-serve. Chat bots is an interesting one because it's not always obvious to the consumer, of course, whether it's real or whether it's automated. So rather than try to get into all of that in a consumer survey, the question was, would you rather be assisted or would you rather serve yourself? But the implication is it's a human assistant. There asks, will the presentation be made available after the webinar? I can go one better than that. You'll have the full report. So we've only got time in this hour to give you a snapshot of what's in the report. There's a lot more in the report than we have time to share with you today. So please look out for the email that contains a download link. So Andy and Neris will bring you back on in a few minutes. I'm just going to go back to my presentation now and get on to some other hot topics, and then invite you back in shortly to discuss those. So let's get into channels. So we've already had some initial debate about channels. So I'm going to give you a bit more of a deep dive into channels, and specifically channel preferences. And this is really where your large cup of caffeinated beverage really could come into play, because it's quite dense data, and it's quite difficult to simplify this and make it presentable. It's much easier when you've actually got a physical report in front of you to read. So I am going to warn you, it's a lot of data, and this one in particular is really, really scary. I'm so sorry. There's too much data, I know. But I just want, I don't expect you to take any insights out of this in the 30 seconds I've got it on screen. It's in the report. I just want to explain to you what it is. So the question is, if you were to contact an organisation or given a choice of contact methods, which would be the method you would typically choose? So you've got a number of different journeys. So the methods are shown, the preferred methods are shown by journey. This is what consumers, if they were given the choice, would like to use for each of these types of queries. And then you can see in the different coloured bars, these are the different types of channels that people would choose. And actually, there's a much longer list here. I've grouped a bunch of the channels that didn't get a large share of preference into this other bucket. So within the other bucket, you've got things like chatbots, you've got things like IVR, because let's face it, nobody would actually say, I would prefer IVR if you have the choice of other channels. Nobody today would actually say, I would prefer a chatbot, because why would you? If you could have a phone call, why would you prefer a chatbot? So what really stands out here are the 5 big channels: phone, website, email, smartphone app, and live chat. So what I'm going to try to do is break it down a little bit and hopefully make it a little bit easier for some of these things to pop out for you in this hour. So let's have a look at the, if you like, the phone versus email, the 2 big ones, of course, for most of us. Let's look at the phone versus email equation across the different channels. And what's a couple of things really stand out for me. So when it comes to fraud, and this is, again, a really good example of when you need assistance, when you suspect that you've been a victim of fraud, you want to have a phone call with somebody. You're not going to email somebody. That's where it's emotive, it's urgent, you want some empathy, you're going to phone somebody. So that's probably not a surprise. But what's interesting here is that across many of the other journeys, email is equivalent to or even higher than phone in terms of preference. 30% of people would email their complaint. Only 27% of people would phone in their complaint. That's really interesting. That's really interesting to me. So I know a lot of providers don't like email, and there's a lot of reasons for that, because email is hard to resource. But from a customer perspective, there's still a strong level of residual preference for email. And the thing to bear in mind here is that when you interpret survey results, these are always a reflection of what we give people. You can never ask people about the future. You can never ask people about things they don't know. So you're never going to see things like WhatsApp come up really high, because most people just haven't had the experience using WhatsApp for customer service. As channels like WhatsApp for customer service start to become more available, you're going to start to see the preference increase. So these data and this sort of survey result actually reflects to a large extent what we're offering people and what has become normalized and accepted and people have become comfortable with. It doesn't necessarily mean that because people aren't selecting WhatsApp, that means we shouldn't offer WhatsApp. It means we should offer what we think is right, and let's see what lands with our customer base. So let's have a look at another pair of channels. One is the smartphone app and one is the provider website. And this is a really good example. Smartphone app only has a relatively small share of preference. Does that mean that people don't want apps? It means actually rather that people aren't familiar with using apps, because in the main, most providers don't offer app-based customer service for most of these journeys. But the one journey that is actually starting to become really common, at least in the UK, is checking your bank balance. That's where the banks certainly are on the front foot, and it's starting to normalize the use of an app. Why would I ever pick up the phone or engage in an IVR to check my bank balance when I've got it in my app? It's a no-brainer for me. And that is an example of how once you start to create a journey that is convenient, that people want to use, you start to see that share of preference start to come up. So right now, the app isn't there, but when it comes to account balance, it's starting to come up. And over time, it's going to be interesting to see where we are next year in terms of preference for the app. If we start pushing more app-based journeys to our customers and we make those journeys convenient, easy to use, and solve the problem, then I have no doubt that the preference will start to increase as a result. So that's all I'll share with you today, but obviously there's a lot of rich information in there around channels in the report, available for download later today. Okay, so let's move on and have a look at some of the quotes around these channel pieces. With the cost of living increasing at such a rate, there's more urgency. I think we'll see more heightened pressure, for example, a real need to try and sort of refund, which actually was quite an eye-opener for me, and it makes a lot of sense with all the financial constraint and increase of vulnerability. The need to get your problem solved quickly can really, really, really be a pressing issue, much more pressing than ever before. And the demand for assisted channels, or at least the demand for first contact resolution, whichever channel you're using, is becoming more and more important in this environment in which we're all living. The shift to digital channels. On the phone, you're pretty much a captive audience, whereas web chat might push people toward contact on weekends, out of hours, and during the day as well. So that actually refers to something that I haven't shared with you, but it's in the report. It's around times of day that people would like to be contacted. And of course, the difference with self-serve is that it's available 24/7, whereas assisted channels are not available 24/7. So let me shift gears completely and talk about something completely different. And this is one of the new topics that we've covered in the 2022 research. And this is around understanding how people feel about organizations generally. And why is this important? Well, I asked a question of you in our poll. Have you ever stopped buying from an organization because you didn't disagree with its values? And 74% of us said yes. I'll share with you in a minute what the results are from the public. But more and more, I think the idea of values, alignment with values, which has always been a huge topic within the customer arena and is now starting to become a really big topic within the colleague environment. So more and more, we know that people want to work for us. They'll want to come and take jobs in the contact center and stay with us because they feel alignment with the values. So I think this piece around values was an interesting one to explore in 2022. Have you ever stopped buying from an organization because you disagreed with their values? So this community on this call tracks a little bit higher than the general public. The score for the general public is about 39%, but I've broken it down here, and I've broken it down really quite finely in terms of the really fine age groups, as you can see here. And it's really the 25 to 34 group that are leading the way. So if you look at the UK public, almost 1 in 2 people in the 25 to 34 age group say, yeah, I've actually voted with my feet. I've stopped buying from an organization. And that's interesting. That, for me, sort of signifies that's your key demographic, where, if you like, the consciousness of values, of the consciousness of buying in a socially responsible way, of signaling your consumption choices and your brand affinities, is really, really important in that group. And as you might expect, it's relatively lower for people aged 55 to 64 and 65 plus. But even then, you've got quite a lot of people who say, yeah, I've actually voted with my feet. Let's move on to another, I'm afraid, somewhat complex piece of research, and there's no easy way to simplify this. So it's much better if you sit down and read the report. What we've done here is that we've looked at perceptions of different industry sectors across these 10 statements, all related to the world of customer contact. I won't read them out, but you can quickly scan them. And we're interested in, the question was, would you agree that banks, utilities, mobile phone companies, we've got 6 industries and 10 statements. And the question was, tick if you think that this statement applies to this industry. So what this is going to tell us in just a second when I go to the next chart is, what are we doing well? If you're working in banking, what do consumers think you're doing well? And where are there some opportunities to improve? So I'm going to show this data to you in 2 ways, and be prepared, the next chart is scary. I warned you. There's a lot of data on this chart. It's in the report. I scan all these numbers because there's just not enough time to do that. But what this really tells you, and when you have time to look at the report, and what this tells you, there's actually quite considerable difference across the sectors. If you scan left to right, if you pick any of the statements, you can see that there's actually quite a significant difference, with banks generally being seen as more positively compared to other sectors, and government organizations generally seen somewhat less positively across most of the statements compared to other sectors. So really the one takeaway is, think about the industry in which you work, and this is an interesting benchmark against other kinds of industries to see actually it's not all the same, and the public does have different perceptions of different industry sectors depending on depending on the statements in question. Here's a different visualization of this, which might be a little bit easier for you to assimilate. And what we've got here is from least good to best, going clockwise. So 12 o'clock, a good place to work, contribute to the wider community, is where we've got the least scores, if you like, the least percentages of people saying, yeah, that applies to this. And that you can see the pattern is fairly similar across sectors. So the yellow line here is your government organisations, and your blue line here are banks. And what banks do actually stand out for, to give you one example, is can be trusted to do the right thing most of the time. That's quite interesting. Banks really stand out from other sectors. But the two out of the 10 statements where organisations are seen to be strongest are helpful customer service staff and customer service is friendly. So these are the things that we're getting right. The areas where perhaps there's room to improve would be give me personal service that makes me feel recognised, have the customer's best interests at heart. So that's my attempt at trying to condense some really dense research and some dense data into a couple of minutes. I can never do that justice, but hopefully when you read the report, you'll be able to pull out some useful insights for you. Here are some quotes. Banks spend a lot on advertising that tells us they're here to help. I think that's influencing perceptions more than the actual customer experience. The water industry doesn't advertise in the same way. That's a quote from someone in the water industry. And actually, I think that's probably true. We know this. I've done advertising and brand research for a long, long time. And actually, advertising has a huge impact. And experience has a huge impact as well. So your actual experience has an impact on how you feel about banks and water companies, but also what they tell you through advertising and comms also has a huge impact. So the fact that banks do invest a lot in television, for example, telling us how much they care, probably does have a bearing on this. Here's an interesting one. Years ago, call centres were seen as bland, cardboard soulless. Maybe it was the way the industry was featured in sitcoms. I think that's slightly changing now. I think amazing communication that demyths some of the old stereotypes. I've talked a lot in other presentations about the need to reposition and reframe the contact centre industry, both to the general public, but also particularly right now when we're trying to hire people and the competition for talent is more strong than it ever was before. That need to reposition, and we know how satisfying, rewarding, and what great careers you can have by working in the contact centre, but there's still a gap between what we know to be true and how the general public feels about contact centres. We've been looking to how to connect sustainability with the contact centre operation. We're pretty much 100% home working now. So perhaps from a sustainability perspective, we're doing our bit by not having people travelling to an office every single day. It's about trying to find ways within our world to make a difference. Really, really important, particularly as in that critical 25 to 34 consumer group, people are looking to make their decisions, buy and choose brands that they see as sustainable. And that's only going to continue in the years ahead. So being seen to be operating sustainably is really important. And how can we be seen and actually operate sustainably in the contact center is a question that we'll keep coming back to. Final section of the presentation. So I've talked broadly about perceptions of industry sectors. Let's drill into careers in the contact center, careers in customer service. The question is, on a scale of 1 to 5, where 5 is excellent and 1 equals very poor, how would you rate a career in customer service in terms of each of these following areas? So we've got 7 statements, 7 areas. Where do we have the most positive rating specifically about customer service? Interestingly, if you were paying attention earlier, generally speaking, most organizations don't get a particularly positive rating for contributing to the community. But when you ask people about customer service specifically, how would you rate working in the customer service industry? People do rate this positively. And that's really encouraging, I think. It's really encouraging. It reflects a general public recognition that customer service people do a genuinely important job for the communities in which they operate. Also quite positive ratings for flexible hours, and relatively positive ratings for opportunities to learn new things. Where is there perhaps the greatest room to grow? Pay and benefits, not seen as quite as great. Career progression opportunities, perhaps seen as quite as great. It's going to be interesting to see 12 months from now, if we ask this question again, how things may have moved on. Quote from one of the people that we talk to. Most of our recruitment comes from word of mouth. A lot of people do have the opinion that customer service people must be against it. They must hate their jobs. They're surprised when a lot of people say they enjoy it. So that's testament to the gap between public perception and what we know to be true in the industry. a breakdown of women and men. And I believe, depending on who you talk to, that approximately 60% of the UK workforce in contact centres is female. So there is a gender skew, slight gender skew. Probably different, of course, depending on individual operations, but there are more women than there are men. And it somewhat bears out, actually, if you look at this split. So you do see more positive ratings across all of these statements among women, and particularly a career in customer service is suitable for someone like me. There's quite a noticeable difference when it comes to women versus men, and opportunities to learn new things. There's quite a notable difference when it comes to women versus men. And this is, I thought, quite an insightful quote. From a young age, being caring, kind, and helpful are not necessarily seen as fantastic attributes that males should have. I think this will change in time. So as we are looking to attract people of all genders, it's really important to think about how we frame and how we position, particularly to attract perhaps people who historically have not been as attracted, men, and maybe have not seen, and of course I'm generalizing, but perhaps it hasn't been sort of the natural option for men to work in contact centres. How do we reframe and reposition? To summarise, before we come back to Neris, the generational gap is widening when it comes to the outlook for customer service. So I showed you the age breakdowns, and things are not getting better in the eyes of the 55 plus, and that's an awful lot of people who are not happy about the direction. What are we doing to ensure that their needs are being addressed? We're seeing this sort of savviness emerge around self-serve. Consumers are learning what self-serve is good for. It's great for those simple journeys, maybe not so good for those complex journeys where I really want to go back to assisted channels. If we disagree with the provider's values, many of us are willing to vote with our feet. 48% of us aged 25 to 34, 74% of us on this webinar today. The great news is the general public holds mostly positive opinions about careers in customer service, particularly customer service's contribution to the community and the flexible hours, where perhaps we need to think about the communication and the dialing up is around pay and benefits, and it's around opportunities to learn new things. Thank you so much. I'd like to invite Neris back to the floor. I think Andy might have just stepped away, so it's just you and me, Neris. What do you think about all of that?
Okay. Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? So I guess let's take it one by one. Channel preference and email still going strong. What I found interesting, Stephen, was you said email is hard to resource. And when I audit and work with different contact centres, a lot of that is down to the poor execution of email as a channel. So there's no getting away from the fact that it serves lots of contact drivers, especially around complaints, because it's auditable. People can do their whole ranting and that side of things. But what you tend to find is that it sits in an adjunct solution, either going straight into the CRM or into Outlook even. And of course, that's hugely inefficient. So there are ways to better control email by having it in a fixed form for a start, by routing it into your unified queue, and by automating an awful lot of it through analytics and bot management. So it's fascinating to see email is here. I tell so many people, kill email. It's a terrible channel. But of course, until other channels come up, self-service comes up, then it's here to stay. So that's really interesting. Love the values part, and how, the 25-year, that bracket, 25 to 35, are real activists, and it really matters to them. And then when you look at the qualities that you've asked about in the survey, the implicit, what it's saying is, if I need to hear that somebody and see that somebody in your organization is being treated well. So when I do audits, for example, I went to one contact center who will never be named, and the way that they were treating the agents was disgusting. So I pretty much walked out before saying, that is disgusting. Are you joking? And walked out. And I think that we're seeing that now with brand choices. And Neil's asked the question around consumers flipping and saying, actually, before you decide on your insurance company or somebody that you're going to have a long-term relationship with, are you looking at their values? And yeah, it's a very interesting one, that is, because of course there's lots of online companies that perhaps don't pay their taxes. Anyway, I'm not going to go into all of that, but
can I interrupt you, Neris? Yeah. Can I interrupt you just to pick up on that? And also, it's a question from Neil in the group. Have you done any research on values being considered before becoming a customer? Which I think you're speaking to. And one of a couple of the people that I talked to in the discussions in the contact center leader discussions talked about the difference between what people say and what people do. And certainly it's, I'm going to choose my words extremely carefully, but it's certainly very common now for us to espouse values. And again, there's limitations to a survey, and all we can report is what people say they've done. Is that what actually people have done? And the quote, which is, well, I'll try to repeat from memory, was something like, if you're faced between the choice of brand A, that's half the price, and brand B, got better values, what are you going to do? Particularly at a time we're all more strapped for cash than we ever were before. Is there the possibility that people are overclaiming, or even that activist group are doing it slightly performatively, and they're sort of doing it because if you're being a bit cynical, they're doing it because they want to be seen to be doing it, but is that really being reflected in consumption choices?
Yeah, and it's an interesting one, isn't it? So there's loads of champagne socialists out there, aren't there? So I think the reality is there's green shoots of recognizing that that's something that should be considered. At the moment, yes, people probably are prioritizing cost and convenience. So convenience is a factor in that as well, because if a brand's going to get me something here then tomorrow, and averse it, and perhaps some of its values aren't what I know I should be aligning myself to. Yeah, I think people are consciously talking the right talk, but like you say, probably in the back end, there's not enough due diligence being done as to the integrity about how they, about their supply lines and those side of things. But we are seeing brands recognizing that they need to do a lot more, especially in the fashion world, aren't we? Yeah. That they need to do a lot more about the integrity of their supply lines. So, yeah.
And I don't want to sound like I'm downplaying the importance of talk, because it's actually really important we talk about it, because typically you've got to talk about it before you see any action. So if we want action, we've got to start talking. Exactly. I want to come back to the email piece. When you have recommended to your clients that actually maybe they should think of alternatives, what sort of journeys and what sort of channels typically are there alternatives to email, where currently email is being used? What are some better options?
I think the expectation about responsiveness on direct messaging, whether that be WhatsApp or Facebook, the most common, although outside of the UK, there's lots of Apple Chat in Europe. I think those are because they're seen as, they're more transactional. There's the ability to have more automation sitting within them. So if you're dialing up those and your self-service good enough, then arguably you can kill your email. And it's because the service level that sits behind email, the expectation on the service level, for some reason is like 72 hours, 24 hours. Well, depending on the type of business and the use case, that's just not good enough. Whereas those DM channels are much more responsive, and people's expectations are getting managed quicker.
And can they be resourced with a sort of similar footprint to email and deliver the better responsiveness without incurring a lot more resource overhead?
Yeah, they can. I think they can be resourced with less, obviously, because of concurrency, although claims around concurrency are generally over-exaggerated when you actually talk to the advisors and think about what that experience looks like. But yeah, they are more efficient as channels, as chat channels. They are, yeah.
And the piece around apps is interesting, because that's one of those emerging channels which outside of banks currently hasn't got a lot of traction. Are you seeing with your work more and more providers embracing apps?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and that app journey. But again, I think chat within apps is very good. Because obviously within apps you can self-serve, and that gets you in their ecosystem of communication. So identification and verification, which somebody's just talked about in terms of now the need for two-factor authentication. That is less onerous when you're in an app and you are identified. But what's critical about that is, like we were talking about earlier, you can elevate out of it as and when you need to, and that happens seamlessly. So definitely seeing more apps, definitely seeing more innovation within apps as well. But if the need arises, there has to be that get out to an assisted or a live agent.
Absolutely. We're almost out of time, and I do want to bring Neil to the stage in just a moment, but I've just seen a couple of quick comments and questions come through. Simon raises a really good point, which I completely agree with. It really depends on what you're buying on the values. Something like a pint of milk is really different to something much more involved, high value purchase, where perhaps those values, those organizational brand values, are more important. So I couldn't agree more. Mike makes the comment, DM channels can increase customers' expectations unrealistically. Contact forms allow you to manage expectations. Would you respond to that, Neris?
Look, I talk to a lot of customers that are doing swathes of analytics on sentiment. Just ask your customer what channel they want to interact with you with and what their expectations are on how quickly you respond. So then you close the gap on expectation management, because definitely customer experience falls down that gap between expectation and reality. But just find out the expectations, not by analysing, by asking and being very explicit, and then manage according to that. That would be brave. That would deliver good customer experience.
Neris Caulfield in the Action Consulting, thank you so much for your time. Just one last order of business, and that's to invite Neil Titcombe, the MD of Odigo UK and Ireland, to the stage. Thank you once again for supporting us on this research this year, Neil.
You're very welcome, Stephen. Always a pleasure to continue the support of this really important report. It is generally so interesting to learn this data. As a vendor trying to provide the best tools and services to the industry to provide the best service to their customers, we can't shape that without having the insight of knowing what our customers are doing. And I think post pandemic and now in an economic challenge, getting into the detail of how specific cohorts with age and even location against different channels, etc., is so important. And your report just reveals it's never static and is always evolving. And I think one thing that stood out for me was the very first point you made around the age adoption in terms of channel adoption and that 55 age group cohort not necessarily being included in digital adoption. I mean, I didn't know there were 16 million 55-year-olds in the UK, and your report suggests that we are still not necessarily including them in some of the new innovations and customer experiences. So more food for thought for us, and something which just, I guess, highlights the thing I've always championed, which one size definitely does not fit all.
Here. Neil, thank you so much again. Neris, thanks so much for your time, and thank you to all of you for dialing in, taking the time today. Please look out for the download. You may get an email, or if not, just log on to ccma.org.uk later today, and the full report, which includes everything I presented today and a lot more, will be available for you. Thanks so much again. Enjoy the rest of your day. Take care, everyone.
Thanks. Cheers.
Bye.